the murderers returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on Josiah and Sarah, the Eldermores, knocking over a shoe that had filled with blood as they did so, before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom and killing Ina and Lena. Strangely afterwards, a 4-pound slab of bacon was taken out of the kitchen icebox and laid next to the axe. Now, I read a lot about serial murderers and I watch a lot of documentaries, and the only reason I can think that a murderer would have a piece of cold meat on the scene is so that they could have sex with it. I may be wrong, of course, and as far as I can tell, there isn't any evidence to say that there was any bodily fluids on the bacon, but it's just a theory in my opinion. Investigators also found untouched food and bloody water during the search. The investigators believed that all the victims, except for Lena Stillinger, had been asleep when murdered. They thought that she was awake and tried to fight back, as she was the only one found lying crosswise on the bed, and with a defensive wound on her arm. Lena's nightgown was pushed up to the waist. She was wearing no undergarments, leading to law enforcement to speculate that the killer sexually molested her or attempted to do so. Rarely has a small town been faced with such a devastating or frightening event as Villisca that Monday morning. That night, along with the darkness, came the fear that a madman was on the loose and might strike again. During the ensuing days, families doubled up with shotguns and guarded their properties all night long. Locks were sold out, windows nailed shut, and dogs were prized above all else. Despite all this, however, officers were unable to catch the killer. On Tuesday, the 11th of June, M.W. McClary, an assistant warden and fingerprint expert at Leavenworth Penitentiary, arrived to investigate the scene. However, community confidence in this expert was immediately shaken when he left the train by falling down drunk. When he finally sobered up, he did make a very detailed analysis of the scene, but unfortunately no usable fingerprints were found. In addition to the fingerprints, he did carefully analyse blood splatter and axe cuts that were made in the ceiling upstairs. His detailed study led him to conclude that the killer was left-handed when striking the children in the south room. Striking the children in the south room had been in a frenzy, waving the axe one-handed over his head. Hundreds of leads and thousands of rumours directed investigators. It seemed everyone was suggested as a suspect by someone. All that came out of the rumours was a week of intensive investigation down a long, cold trail. Over time, many possible suspects emerged, and I've included here a small handful. The first one, Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born travelling minister in town on the night of the murders. He was described as peculiar, as when an adolescent he reportedly suffered a mental breakdown. As an adult, he was accused of being a peeping Tom and asked several young women and girls to pose nude for him. On June the 8th, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day services, which the Moore family attended. He left town between 5 a.m. and 5:50 a.m. on June the 10th, however, hours before the bodies were discovered. He had confessed to the murders in court, but the jury didn't believe him. In the weeks that followed, the Reverend displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators and family of the deceased. This aroused suspicion, and a private investigator wrote back to Reverend Kelly asking for details that the minister might know about the murders. Kelly replied with detail, claiming to have heard sounds and possibly even witnessing the murders. His known mental illness made authorities question whether he knew the details because he committed the murders, or was this just his imagination? 2 years after the murders, in 1914, Reverend Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. He was sent to a national mental health hospital in Washington, D.C., named St. Elizabeth's. Investigators speculated once again that Kelly could be the murderer of the Moore family. Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders in 1917. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of interrogation, and Kelly later recanted this confession. After 2 separate court trials, he was acquitted. The second man is Frank F. Jones, Villisca resident Frank Fernando Jones, who was also an Ohio state senator. Excuse me. The father, Josiah Moore, had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his store. Moore reportedly took a lot of business away from Frank Jones. Moore was also rumoured to have had a sexual affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law, though there is no evidence to be found that supports this theory. Third up, William Mansfield. Another theory was that Senator Jones had hired William Blackie Mansfield to murder the Moore family. Although after doing some research, I can't really find any evidence to confirm or deny that this was the case. 9 months before the murders at Villisca, a similar case of an axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs. 2 axe murder cases followed in Ellsworth and Puyallup in Kansas. The murders in Colorado Springs were closely related in execution to those in the Moore house. H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, and Mrs. A.J. Burnham were found dead, murdered with an axe, and their bedsheets were also used to cover the windows to prevent any passers-by from looking in. At the Moore house, the murderer hung aprons and skirts to cover the windows, as in the murders in Villisca. The murderer in Colorado Springs also wiped the blood off the axe and covered the heads of the victims with bedclothes. Both the cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person or persons. Other murders reported as possibly being linked to these crimes include the numerous unsolved axe murders along with the Southern Pacific Railroad from 1911 to 1912 by the unsolved Axeman killings of New Orleans, as well as several other such murders during this time period. William Mansfield was also the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkerson, with Wilkerson even suggesting that William Mansfield was a cocaine-addicted serial killer. Wilkerson also believed that Mansfield was responsible for the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, on the 5th of July 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders. But the list doesn't stop there. Oh no. Wilkerson also believes he was responsible for the axe murders committed in Puyallup, Kansas, 4 days before the Villisca murders, and the murders of Jenny Patterson and Jenny Miller in Aurora, Illinois, although the date of their deaths eludes me at the moment. According to Wilkerson's investigation, all the murders were committed in precisely the same manner, indicating that the same man probably committed them. Wilkerson stated that he could prove that Mansfield was present in each of the differing crime scenes on the night of the murders. In each murder, the victims were hacked to death with an axe, and the mirrors in the homes were covered. A burning lamp with the chimney off was left at the foot of the bed, and a basin in which the murderer washed was found in the kitchen. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, which Wilkerson believed was strong evidence that the one man was Mansfield, who knew his fingerprints were on file at the federal military prison in Leavenworth. Wilkerson managed to convince a grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. However, Payroll records provided an alibi that placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for lack of evidence and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson and was awarded $2,225. Wilkerson believed that pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release but also in the subsequent arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. Number 4. Henry Lee Moore. A suspected serial killer who was not related to the slain Moore family, but was convicted of murdering his mother and grandmother several months after the Villisca murders. His weapon of choice was an axe. Before and after the murders in Villisca, a very similar axe murder on his mother and grandmother were committed, and all of the cases showed striking similarities, leading to strong suspicion that some or all of the crimes were committed by an axe-murdering serial killer and, just like Blackie Mansfield, the axe-murdering Henry Moore can also be considered a suspect in some of these slayings. Number 5. Paul Mueller. In the 2017 book, The Man from the Train, by Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James, they discussed the Villisca murders as part of a much larger series of murders, which they believe were all committed by a single serial killer. They conclude the murderer was Paul Mueller, or Miller, an immigrant possibly from Germany who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole suspect in an 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had employed him as a farmhand. Bill James started his research in an attempt to solve the Villisca murders, and along with his daughter found archival newspaper stories detailing dozens of families murdered under similar circumstances across the US. The Jameses thus believed that Mueller was guilty of the Villisca murders as part of a killing spree that lasted over a decade, killing at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents, including the Colorado Springs and Puyallup crimes in Kansas. The Jameses identified common features to these crimes, many of which are also found in the Villisca scene. The killer selected families who lived near railroad tracks, which is why the killer was suspected to have travelled, hence the title of their book, who seemingly struck in ambush at about midnight, while the victims were asleep, using the blunt side of an axe rather than the blade to strike the victims in the head and face. He used an axe found at the victim's home and left it in plain sight after the murders. He covered the victims with blankets to prevent blood splatter, covered windows from inside the house, and locked the doors before departure. In Mueller's suspected crimes there was often, but not always, a sexual motive directed towards a pubescent girl, as with Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12, being partly disrobed in the Villisca murders. On the dust jacket text of the hardcover edition of The Man from the Train, professor and crime writer Harold Schlechter writes that the Jameses offered the most probable solution yet for the Villisca murders. There are other suspects, and you can read about online, but I found those to be the most interesting ones. Today, the entire dossier is currently held in the state of Iowa archives. All court action has ceased and all hope of solving the case by legal channels has ended. Montgomery County citizens, exhausted and bitter, try to put the case behind them. But feelings do come back to life whenever someone new makes a confession or the local press decides to run a feature article about the case, or one of the principals has died. Even though strong feelings remain and the resentment festers, official actions pertaining to the Villisca axe murders have ended. The Moore House has been purchased, renovated, and opened as a private museum by an entrepreneur. The Villisca's murder is over 100 years old now. It is the only Iowa crime that has historical legs. In this sense, it is like two other great murder epics, Jack the Ripper